Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for this fireside chat. My name is Sally Hayns, I'm CIEEM's CEO, and I'm here in front of the fire at CIEEM's HQ in my cosy slippers, looking forward to the next 90 minutes of conversation, which is part of CIEEM's 30th anniversary celebrations. We will be looking back over the next 90 minutes at what the Institute has achieved, but perhaps even more importantly, what changes, challenges, and opportunities there may be in the next 30 years. We are recording this conversation and it will be added to our YouTube channel and also our CIEEM website resource hub later this week. I'm really pleased to say that we've brought together an illustrious panel of past presidents of the Institute and the current president to look at where CIEEM has come from and then to look to the future. I've been musing on the collective noun for a group of presidents, and with a love of alliteration, I've been wondering whether we have a phenomenon of presidents, a pandemonium, preponderance, or perspicacity. Either way, we're grateful to them all for sharing their time with us this evening. There is an opportunity for you, our audience, to ask questions. So please feel free to put any questions in the Q&A function at any time, and you'll find the button for that at the bottom of your screen. If you want to make a comment, then please feel free to use the chat function. But for questions, please use the Q&A function. Now, the panel we have with us today include Max Wade, our current CIEEM president, Steph Wray, Steve Ormerod, and Chris Spray. And I'm going to ask them each to very briefly introduce themselves, explain what they do, tell us what period they were or are the president, and also what career they would have chosen if they couldn't do what they do now. So Max, I'll start with you if I may.
Oh, thank you, Sally. Well, at the moment, I am a technical director ecology with Ecological. Been here for a few years now. Prior to sort of previous company I worked for, I actually spent the first half of my career in higher education as an ecology lecturer. As to the career I would have followed had I not become an ecologist, I narrowly escaped probably becoming a Jesuit, having been taught by the Jesuits for most of my school life. A soldier, my father was a soldier, and I'm sure he was very keen that I followed in his footsteps. I'd have had to have been a naturalist of some sort, one way or another. I remember getting up being allowed out of bed to come down and watch David Attenborough on his zoo quest in Indonesia. And I think one way or another, I was going to have to be something like that, Sally.
Thank you very much. Steph, can I ask the same of you, please?
Hello. So I'm Steph Wray. I'm also a consultant, I'm afraid. I've worked in a range of consultancies, big and small, and currently work for a little boutique consultancy called Nature Positive. I was president between 2015 and 2018. And what would I do if I couldn't be an ecologist? Well, I think I'm well known for having an American quarter horse and some very smart vegan cowboy boots. So I'm going to say I'd been a cowboy.
Oh, fantastic. Steve, follow that.
I'm still working on the collective name for presidents, and I thought you were going to work up to a pomposity of presidents.
I wouldn't dream of it.
But yeah, well, so I was president 2008, 2010, and at that time I was already professor of ecology in Cardiff University, which I still am. I also have a couple of other roles. I'm deputy chairman of Natural Resources Wales. I sit on GenCC, I'm vice president of RSPB, so I guess my work straddles quite a few different sectors around the environment, ecology, climate in general. What would my ideal career have been had I not been an academic? One of the reasons I am an academic is because I hate formality. And I think academics are extremely good at finding ways of bending rules, not doing what they're told, delivering late on all kinds of things that consultants are very good at delivering on time. So any alternative for me would have to be something informal in the arts. Music, for example, I like music. I play a musical instrument. Literature and writing, probably still advocating for the environment in some kind of artistic way, disseminating some of the key messages that we've got to get out about the plight we're in, but reaching audiences that perhaps we in the profession don't always reach as well as we should.
Great, thank you, Steve. And Chris, could you?
Right, I'm Chris Wray. I'm sort of semi-retired Professor of Water Science and Policy at the UNESCO Centre for Water Law, Science and Policy at University of Dundee, which is a heck of a mouthful. I'm still a wetland ecologist, though. I've actually spent the whole of today plodging around looking at various ponds on the Eddleston Water, part of Tweed. I've been involved with Tweed Forum now for almost 30 years, one way or another. So heavily into river restoration and this sort of thing. Also, swans have occupied an awful lot of my life all around the world. And currently I'm also a board member of Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park. So desperately trying to add ecology to the fact that we have 70% of Scotland's population living within 1 hour's drive time. And boy, do they appreciate the park. The ecologists maybe have to suffer a little bit from that. But anyhow, we are definitely now progressing that. If I wasn't doing all of this lot, well, I was born and brought up in Wiltshire. And I wanted to be a farmer until someone pointed out to me I wouldn't own a farm. That wasn't for people like me. So that one went out the window. So then I wanted to be a historical geographer. Again, having been born and brought up right next to Avebury and that part of the world in Marlborough. I just wanted to be a historical geographer. And that sort of became a biogeographer and a biologist. And I've been basically paddling around in rivers and watching badgers since I was about 5.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, I'm going to stick with you, if I may, Chris, and say, well, thinking back to the period that you were president, what was the, where was the Institute at that time? And what do you think was the biggest achievement during your time as president that you feel most proud of being part of?
Okay, well, I go back to about 2005 when I was president. I had a failed attempt to be an earlier president, but David Good, I'm pleased to say, did the job rather well. I was then just finishing being a director of environment for Northumbrian Water and became director of environmental science for CEPA, so the Scottish Environment Protection Agency. So I'd just gone from private to regulatory. And one of the things that we were doing as an institute then was trying to shake off a very unfair view from the external people that we were the consultants club. And in fact, therefore, having someone who, was a director from CEPA and very supported by my then chief executive, that was a great move forward. We had at that time 2,500 members, to put you in sort of context what we're talking about, 2005. And looking back, I've been looking back at my council report and what Jim was writing at the time. And we were talking about a period of stability and the beginning of growth. In fact, very rapid growth, because from 500, you can grow quite rapidly. But we'd had our problems beforehand. And this was now the beginning of financial stability and the beginning of some pretty fast growth, which was really good to see. And also, I think the sort of beginning of geographical sections really becoming a big force in their own right. I think we'd always thought of them, but now actually they were becoming more and more. And the one I saw an awful lot of one was the Scottish one at the time. In terms of the things I would probably be most proud of, at the conference that year, we showcased this brand new guidelines for ecological impact assessment. And we got the statutory agencies to put their stamps on the front. I claim no credit for that whatsoever, but it did occur during my bailiwick. So I'm answering the question correctly, but I'd like to pass the credit to where it was due, which was John Box and numerous others at the time. And on a contentious note, actually, what was interesting, I remember we responded along with numerous others to NERC's consultations on the demise of CEH. So that was when Monk's Wood, which, to me was an icon from, as a child, and Bankery, where I also did lots of work when I was up in Aberdeen, those two were closed down and restructuring. I remember as a group, the whole of the Institute were just horrified that this was happening. And we tried to say so in places where it might do some good. So that's where we were. And I think we were beginning to get, you know, NGOs and others involved and see us as something that was here to stay. Luckily, that's where it's happened.
Great, thank you, Chris. Steve, chronologically, you're next after Chris. So could I pose the same questions to you, please?
Yes, I think I became president, followed Andy Tasker, who was president prior to me. Andy, sadly, no longer with us. But I think that my period started very much as one of consolidation around what the Institute had achieved, coming out of some difficult previous circumstances around legal case, one particular legal case that was quite unfortunate, which Chris will know far more about, around kind of individual contestation of various things. Certainly the Institute very much finding its feet when it came into being. People who advocated for the Institute were interested in suggesting there should be better standards of professionalism in ecology, there should be a better career structure for ecologists, there should be some kind of equivalent status for ecologists as professionals, and there was some kind of extent that we had to enhance the public perception of ecology. And those were still very much consolidating themes. But there was a kind of what I'm going to call, Sally, a bit more of a revolution that came about in my presidency, which was that Jim Thompson came to the end of his term of office, and I recruited for the first time a female chief executive to head the Institute, and I also recruited the next president, who was also a female. So my biggest source of pride and joy in stepping away from the presidency was leaving you, Sally, in charge with Penny Anderson as president at your side. And I think that, to me, was a really, really important signal. And what was even more interesting is that we interviewed two people actually for your role, both of whom were women, who had beaten off all the competition. So, you know, what a fantastic way in the days that we now talk about equality, diversity and inclusion, we were already reaching in the profession that point where we had an all-female team at the head of the organisation.
Great, thank you, Steve. And you've actually given me the perfect opportunity also. I just wanted to recognise all the work of Jim Thompson, who was my predecessor in this role for many, many years. And certainly was pivotal in helping to steer the organisation through those difficult times that you mentioned, and then into that period of growth. So Steph, the second female president.
I think I'm the third female president.
You're third female president. Okay, yes, sorry, Sue Bell. Sorry, Sue.
Sorry, Sue. And I think
I took over from Sue, certainly.
You took over from Sue, yeah.
Also, yeah. But Penny was the first grandma to take the helm. So also important, you've got to trust the grandmas. So yeah, where were we in 2015? Well, we'd already got the Royal Charter, and we were starting to register chartered ecologists for the first time, which was obviously a huge step forward in recognition for the profession, from what Steve was saying around you know, making sure that people recognized it was a profession on a par with others. But I think the issue really for my term of presidency was that we weren't really well known beyond our membership and beyond the immediate people who used our services, if you like. So my main focus was really on the policy and advocacy side of the job, getting our name out there, becoming a recognisable authority for all matters ecological, if you like. So I guess the things that happened during my term of office were forming the strategic policy panel and the country policy panels that feed into that, working across government to set up the all-party parliamentary group for biodiversity, and which is, the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Nature. We got rid of the biodiversity word. And then many meetings with MPs and other parliamentarians. And I suppose the highlight of that, showing that we were actually starting to make an impact in that area, was when we started to be invited to give evidence to select committees. Instead of having to respond reactively to consultations, we were actually being consulted. And I felt that really then, when I handed over to Max, we were in a position where we were making our mark as a learned organisation that people wanted to consult. Thank you, and that's great. And Max, your presidency is still going. You've got another couple of months in the role, so it's possible that over the next couple of months there may be something even more transformative than what you're going to tell us. Was your perspective on the most sort of significant achievement during your time so far?
Thank you, Sally. Yes, I think probably the next couple of months, I don't really want any surprises. I have a surprise as it happens anyway. And yes, Steph set us up extremely well on the policy side. We've been building on that. I think important steps forward have been in our sort of standing as an institute, chartered institute, giving advice both through our sort of publications, interactions with statutory agencies, and growing our membership. That has grown quite significantly, and I think I'd like to couch the pandemic in those sorts of positive terms, and I've tried really hard to do that throughout the pandemic in terms of looking for the positive. And I think one of the things it's shown us, and the feedback continues to come in, as to just how much our members value us, just what calibre we have in terms of our secretariat, who worked under extremely difficult conditions, not just in terms of providing our members with additional support and advice and really a lot of work that was generated, but at the same time, business as usual. We carried on and carried on as though in a way nothing had changed. We set up a sort of exciting group in terms of our sort of recovery from the pandemic. But actually, when we looked at our membership and looked at everything else, it was surprisingly not needing a great deal of recovery. And I think that is testimony to the team, the broader team across our committees, our sort of governance, if you like, the governing board, but very much Sally and the secretariat that enabled us to press on, continuing to make progress, but at the same time, sort of learning the benefits of remote meetings, running conferences remotely, very professionally, and people getting a lot from them, improving our environmental footprint in terms of a lot of what we do. And I think that's probably where I'd sort of finish off in terms of the work, and already mentioned John Box, one of our predecessors, but in terms of looking forward and tackling the challenges environmentally that we face as an institute, we're in a very strong position to lead the way, both in terms of providing that advice, policy, etc., but also in terms of our own behaviours, if you like, in terms of environment. So yeah, positive out of what, in many ways, quite a challenge.
Thank you, and a very useful reminder as well of how much we benefit from and rely on volunteers within the Institute. There's an awful lot of volunteer effort that goes into what we achieve and benefits for members, and we're very fortunate in that regard. So just one last thing then, thinking about the past before we start looking at the future. So we've been in existence now for 30 years. what difference has the Institute made? What's happened as a result of the Institute being in existence that probably would not have happened if IEEM and then CIEEM had not been born? Anybody's thoughts?
Well, I think Steve probably hit it on the head, and that is the growing belief amongst ourselves that ecology and environmental management is a serious profession, because it just was not seen as such for so long. It was almost what you did in the lunchtime between deciding what the engineering options were. You know, you found a local NGO and you talked to them. And there was a big effort to try and actually make sure that ecologists believed that themselves, not just at other people. So it was a twin bit. We had to improve our own credibility, our own standards, our own quality assurance, and we had to shout loudly and have the science evidence base to support it. And I think we've been central to that whole role in those 30 years. So I think Steve was right there highlighting it.
Thank you.
If I could just add to that, Sally, I think that it's around standards in the profession. I think it's around setting standards of competence, particularly for individuals, setting standards of practice. And I think what we've created is actually a very ethical and values-driven organisation, which, you know, I'm not pointing the finger at other professional bodies, but I think perhaps more so than many, we're very conscious about our standards are quite high. We're noted for having a membership standard that's actually a little bit difficult to get in. You have to put some effort in to get into it. I know to the, you know, eternal nuisance factor to our membership team and the secretariat, but, you know, that's important. That standard and that being held to a standard of professional conduct is really been important, I think, and sets us out.
Can I just build on Sally a bit too? First thing I want to say is that how could I ever forget Sue Bell? We are a forgetfulness of presidents as well as anything else. Sue was fantastic, and I learned a huge amount from her in that process. But I mean, one of the other things I think to observe is that when the Institute came into being, in part, it was given a task born out of some concern in the British Ecological Society that ecology was no longer being taken seriously as a discipline. We had, you know, molecular biology starting to grow. There were other areas of biology that were taking over. And so it's almost the Institute came into being to fight for the survival and the beneficial impact that professional ecology had. But if you now look at the way ecology and its importance has grown since that time, it's quite interesting looking back at pieces by David Good and Peter Edwards and others on the 21st birthday at the Institute, essentially pointing out that the Wolf Framework didn't exist when we came into being, the Habitats Directive didn't exist, the Birds Directive didn't exist. Wildlife and Countryside Act was 10 years old only and still wasn't biting. And the whole professional side of ecology has grown enormously, actually, in the 30 years that CIEEM has been in existence. So it's actually partly fostered that growth, it's accompanied that growth, and it's acted as a trusted, independent voice when others have a partisan view. And I think that's another really important element that the professionalism fostered by CIEEM actually brings to the whole area of ecology and environmental management.
Thank you. I mean, I find that really heartening. So, but I think it's time to look to the future. And we've got COP26 coming up, COP15, not very far behind. So, from your perspectives in the roles that you have, what are your aspirations for COP26 and COP15? What do you think really needs to happen coming out of them? Who would like to go first?
Well, it's interesting. I just looked at my council report I wrote back in 2006, and the first paragraph ended, externally, the environment has gained further profile, particularly in both popular and scientific media, but it continues to fail to excite action from amongst politicians, despite their apparent realization that climate change is real and here now. And that's what we were writing in 2006. So I guess that's it, that politicians actually understand it's here, it's real, it's now. And therefore, it is the most important existential threat we actually face, and we need to deal with it.
Steph?
Yeah, I agree entirely, Chris. I think, you know, my biggest hope for both of the COPs is that we all globally take it seriously and actually understand the transformative changes that the parties are signing up to. I think it's really important that we move beyond net zero. The rhetoric of net zero is really pervasive, but it's like we're focusing so closely on net zero that we're ignoring our actual planetary impacts. So, you know, people focusing just on scope 1 and scope 2 emissions when 80–90% of their emissions are largely scope 3, focusing on offsetting, you know, when we know that the recent Oxfam report that to meet the Paris targets, we'd need to, by offsetting, we'd need an area 5 times the size of India. So, you know, we need to get away from that and to focus on the horrible, complicated, messy interactions between all of the ecosystem services that we're affecting by our use of the world, and not just focus on this one narrow area that really isn't going to get us to true sustainability.
Steve, can I ask on your thoughts? Because you have a multiplicity of roles, as you were describing earlier. So I'm really interested on your perspective on this.
Yes, and there are negotiations and decisions being made that are above all our pay grades. I think we've got to be mindful of and recognise that. I mean, I'm a bit conflicted in this area, but I can give you a personal set of perspectives. One of the first things I would suggest people looking in go off and look at is the statement that was brought together a few days ago on September 22nd, the Nature Positive 2030 document that was a statement of what we've achieved and where we need to go on behalf of essentially 5 organisational government bodies in the UK: Natural Resources Wales, Natural England, Scott Nature, Nature Scott, JNCC and Irish government, Northern Irish government. And it makes all kinds of points about the fundamental importance of environment, healthy planet, healthy people, making sure we seek ways of funding environmental gain, mainstreaming nature, pointing out that it's not too late. We still do have hope to be able to turn things around if we act now. And that I think is a really powerful document. That very clearly there are already targets that are before us around what we should be doing. So net zero carbon emissions by 2050, reduction in 78% against 1990 values by 2035, the 30-30 target for protecting land and sea. What I feel most importantly as an individual is that we've got to go beyond the rhetoric to really make those targets bite. So it could be quite easy, for example, for the United Kingdom to claim that we already have almost 30% of our landscape which is designated for nature, but in fact much of that designation is actually landscape designation, and only about 11% of it is actually set aside for biological diversity. Probably about half of that isn't in favourable condition, so we might be down as low as 5%. Well, if we're really, really serious about stopping the decline of nature by 2030 and turning it around, we've got to be looking at what designations actually do for us, how they are supported in law, the kinds of firm targets we make about biodiversity recovery, and essentially mainstreaming the principles of systemic approaches to solving the nature and climate crises, but actually taking appropriate action on the ground that's real and biting and does what we need it to do.
Absolutely. I mean, Max, would you share those thoughts?
Yeah, certainly share all of those thoughts. I think something really important for me is that we understand the sort of the gap, if you like, in terms of our membership, for example, and how they will perceive what comes out of all of this, and how does that actually, how will they do their job differently? How will they understand, as Steve was saying, our designated sites and so on? How, are we looking after them properly? But how does that influence me as an ecologist or an environmental manager in terms of my day-to-day work? And if we're not careful, that can become quite a significant distance. And I get to the point where I'm sort of feeling, well, not really much I can do about that. That's sort of rather a way beyond me. And that must also apply to a certain extent to the general public, although there it tends to be communicated in rather more sort of black and white terms, whereas it's actually really quite difficult in a team meeting, for example, of ecologists to be talking about, how does this impact on us? What are we going to do differently in 2022, 2023, and so on? What's our plan in order to deal with that? And it's interesting when you have those sorts of discussions, it tends to revert back to, okay, well, we obviously need to be using environmentally friendly vehicles and et cetera, as our team, which is great, but it's not the point. As ecologists, we really have to rise to the occasion and start to produce, as Steve was saying, that more holistic approach that pulls everything together. And that's quite a challenge. That's not going to be easy to achieve that across a membership of nearly 7,000. If we're able to do it for even a proportion of that, that will be, in my books, a really important step forward.
But given that surely ecologists and environmental managers have to be demonstrating through their changes to their professional practice, contributing to transformational change to address the climate emergency and biodiversity crisis, how do we drive that? How do we support that? What needs to change? It's easy to talk about a holistic approach, but what do we need to be doing differently?
I would sort of build on some of the things we've been talking about in terms of just our behaviours. There is no reason why now we cannot be much more assertive in whatever fora we are working in. It could be in terms of managing an environmental management project and asserting our views in terms of an integrated approach. Certainly in the work that I do, I've got to get better in a meeting when we are talking about drainage, we're talking about carbon management, a number of environmental factors at the same time as we're talking about the engineering and construction of a road scheme or whatever it happens to be, and making sure that it is an integrated approach, that the drainage fits with the biodiversity, and the biodiversity is linked into vegetation management and ecosystem services, and that the engineers and the planners lock into that approach. So it is joined up and really is meaningful, whereas at the moment, I would argue it's rather disparate. And yes, you can tick the carbon box, you can tick the drainage box, you can tick the biodiversity box, but can we really tick the box that says that all fits together on this scheme? It is a real step forward, not just in terms of the development from a human perspective, the facility, etc., of a road, whatever, but actually, first and foremost, it's delivering environmental gain, and going back to the sort of coherence word, it's got a coherence about it.
I think that's important, Max. We have an example recently where we've recently been appointed on a nationally significant infrastructure project as the biodiversity designer. Now, and by that we don't mean that we're doing the biodiversity chapter of the environmental statement. They've got a consultant doing all of the EIA elements. What they mean is they actually want someone to take a biodiversity and ecosystem services lens across their whole project and look at everything from that perspective. Look at the drainage, look at the landscape, look at the accessibility, look at the socioeconomics, and filter that all through the lens of, well, the natural environment underpins all of that. How is this all going to work together? Now that's a very forward-thinking renewables developer, but I think that's an approach that's going to grow more and more. And I think what that means for our profession is that ecologists have to grow more and more in their role. They have to understand more. They have to be able to deal with the interactions with other disciplines much more and see themselves in that central role in a project, because they are the ones who understand how all of these complex systems interact. That's what ecology is about. And perhaps stepping up and taking roles that might traditionally have been filled by planners or landscape architects.
Are we ready for that role? Or how do we become ready for that role?
Absolutely. I think there's a huge amount in training and development and perception of the profession from really the youngest people coming into the industry, that we're not equipped to tell them what the job will be like in 30 or so years' time. It will be very different to how we are doing the job now, in just the same way that it was very different for us 30 years ago when perhaps we started. So I think we need to be watching this carefully and looking at how it evolves, thinking around, the use of technology, the just different positioning and the different skills and soft skills that will be needed to be an ecologist in the future.
Sally, we need to sort of ask Chris and Steve as well in terms of that sort of, because you both got sort of backgrounds in aquatic ecology. An aquatic ecologist really got a lot of this sorted out quite a long time ago. Not just in what I'm thinking in terms of it spans from vertebrates through invertebrates all the way to microorganisms, which from a terrestrial point of view we haven't got even close to thinking about sort of microorganisms in terms of how we go about doing a lot of what you already do in the freshwater ecology sphere, for example. So why is that? Why, what can we learn? What can we learn? Probably more importantly, what can we learn from the way in which our freshwater ecologist sort of members, colleagues have developed an approach which is very joined up, much more joined up. You may not be completely happy with it, I'm sure you're not, but really interested to know why you think that would be the case.
Not people listening in may not know that Max is also a freshwater ecologist.
I was going to say,
and he and I share the same PhD supervisor, in fact. So, but there is an interesting dimension around freshwater ecosystems in that they integrate everything else going on around them. They are at the end of all terrestrial and atmospheric processes. They're the terrestrial expression of the hydrological cycle, so everything passes through them. And I think we, a long time ago, understood that linkage between, the notion of whatever we did in terrestrial systems had a downstream consequence, and it permeated the way through whole food webs in various ways, and that influence the emergent requirements that we have for ecosystem goods and services. Quite interesting that the extent to which the plight of fresh waters probably is one of the most precipitous of all ecosystems on Earth, at the rate at which fresh waters are losing populations and species. So we're clearly not getting that right, and by definition, we're not getting a lot of other things right as well. But I'm going to pause. Chris might have something to say, but I want to go back to the nub of the question that Sally asked about what CIEEM members and practitioners can actually do. But Chris might have a view on the freshwater side.
Yeah, and I'll come back on that other one as well, because I like that. I think the other thing about freshwaters is it is very visible. If there's a flood, it's obvious, and it affects us immediately. And a lot of these things, if they affect you immediately, you can understand where they come from. And as Steve quite rightly says, if you can understand the connectivity between the activity on the land affects the quality of the water, how you manage it affects runoff, and that has a human impact very, very quickly, both in terms of flooding, but also in terms of drought and all these things. So I think that visibility helps because people can understand connectivity so simply in that. And the other one is, I think actually that people looked at it from two angles. So you had the Water Framework Directive, okay, but even before that existed, you had people like Tweed Forum producing an integrated catchment management plan for 5,000 square kilometres over 2 countries. You've got West Country Rivers Trust, you've got CABA now, you've got a groundswell of organisations which aren't actually single focus. And I think that's helped. The fact it's coming from top down and bottom up. And you've got what I always call these trusted intermediaries working in the middle. And CIEEM can certainly help in that aspect. But Steve, go back to the more general one, and I'll come in on a more general one as well later.
So yeah, so I mean, you know, the point of departure was in what can we do as professional practitioners in ecology, and I think there are 3 areas. The first is actually through our professionalism, and the spectrum of people who are professional ecologists is actually very wide. It cuts across a whole range of different sectors. I think one of our challenges for the future is ensuring that all those sectors are captured as members of the Institute, but that span of professionalism that we're involved with actually gives us an enormous opportunity for influence to follow the appropriate code of conduct that the Institute has. And really, in the end, that's now got to be about being high nature, low carbon. I think that's a real powerful mantra for the way we go forward into the future. I think there's another second set of areas that we can deliver through our citizenship. And again, it sits on the code of conduct in the way we've got to be cognizant of the importance of biodiversity and environment and sustainability and resilience. We have got to be the advocates for sound management that does put environment, climate protection, climate resilience at the heart of all kinds of decision making. Through our citizenship, we actually disseminate the importance of the ecological message. And then I think probably the third is the way we role model for others the kinds of decisions that as a society we should be taking, the way we use food, the way we use energy, the way we use resources, the way we use the transport system. You know, we as an institute have got to be at the sharp end of appropriate role modeling of the kinds of methods of living that others should aspire to. And that should involve us also thinking about intergenerational equity, what we leave behind for the ones who come after. It should also be about social justice, because there are people in the world who do not have the resources that we have, either in our profession or in the developed West. And we have got to think about making do with less so others can reach something closer to our standard of living.
Chris, you wanted to
well, I had 3 which would I think marry with a lot of what you've just said, and it was actually picking up on what Stephanie said in her answers. The first thing I think we need to do is, in any project situation or strategy, be in there agreeing what success looks like. Because if the actual definitions of success, whether it's cost-benefit analysis or whether it's some large-scale questionnaire, doesn't include successful ecological restoration at the right scale or whatever it is, then we're never going to get past being just an add-on to someone else's major decision of success. So I think actually being around the table when the project or whatever it is are actually signed off as what does success look like, it has to have that in there as well as all the other things. The second one is clearly the science evidence base. Learning by doing is a really good way. Not doing doesn't work, but learning by doing and providing that science evidence base, because time and again, what we're being asked for now is, okay, so what is the solution, the best way forward? And we need to be able and confident enough to say, well, with our knowledge at the moment, that's it, and go with it. Because everyone else does that and then changes it in other disciplines, and you learn, by good scientific method, when it goes wrong, you learn what didn't work and you come up with another hypothesis. Well, it's not quite so much that. There are lots of good work being done, and there's lots of evidence in conservation, the sorts of things that Pullen and Bill Sutherland and others have pulled together over the years. And the other one is, and Steve's really touched on this one, is actually as ecologists, we probably have a better idea of spatial and temporal scale than many others, and we need to bring that to the table. It's not just local scale, but it's actually international scale, but sometimes local is the best way to work. And it's certainly temporal scale. I spent a very happy year embedded in Welsh Government, and they have this fantastic Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. And I constantly quote it in discussions up here in Scotland. But this whole idea of what would a 20-year-old say if they were sitting around that table, or a 21 or whatever else. And the National Park, we've now got a youth committee. And it's a very challenging position to sit there, because suddenly the decisions that we say we're going to take in 20 years, or we're going to wait for this piece of research, are no longer acceptable. That generation are actually wanting the answers right now. So I think thinking future generations, so that element of the temporal scale, is something that we can bring.
In an earlier part of our discussion, when we were talking about COP26 and COP15, I think it was you, Steve, mentioned that, you know, we need systemic change. Targets are all very well and good, but actually you gave a really good example of how a target can perhaps appear to be met, but when you start to unpick it, it's maybe not being met as well as it does appear. So in terms of systemic change, are we looking for, well, I presume we're looking for systemic change in individual behaviours, systemic change in corporate behaviours, systemic change at a political level. How are we going to achieve systemic change? What's going to really make the difference that will be the tipping point to create systemic change on any of those levels?
It's a really interesting problem, isn't it? I was brought up as an ecologist in the 1970s on the back of thinking by a man called Paul Ehrlich. And Paul Ehrlich had this notion that environmental damage was the product of material affluence multiplied by population. We can't do very much rapidly about population, but we can do something about our material affluence and resource use. The NRW Sonar report went to the heart of this to a certain extent in pointing out that the systemic things we had to get a handle on were food use and energy use and the transport system, those kinds of things, you know, being prepared to maintain what technology we need to have a better quality of life, but at the same time being prepared to actually really ask ourselves the question about what resources we should be exploiting, what we should be leaving for future generations, and what we should be sharing better. I find the Oxfam donut ecological model extremely interesting in that it actually sees two limits. One is the limit of poverty, which we have got to lift everyone above around the world, but it sees a second limit, which is the extent to which there is a safe limit beyond which we cannot go in the way we exploit resources. And part of the systemic challenge is actually living in that donut envelope where we don't use too much, but at the same time, we give everyone an appropriate quality of life without screwing up the things that keep us alive.
Early this year, I think it was early this year, time goes so quickly, but we had the descriptor review, and there were quite rightly a lot of plaudits for the way the review had been conducted and the messages it then delivered. There are numerous examples in the past 30 years of really, some groundbreaking or apparently groundbreaking reports and reviews, but sometimes it doesn't feel as though very much has changed. Do you see any of you see signs of change as a result of the descriptor review, at least in terms of that systemic political level change?
I would say that the initial signs were really good. The fact that to us as an organisation of ecologists, there was nothing new in the Dasgupta review. There was nothing we weren't already aware of. What was important about it was that it was issued by the Treasury, that it came from an economist, and it was written in those terms, written for economists. So I think that was that was hugely helpful to us as a profession. The government's response to Dasgupta was really helpful. The fact that kind of thinking is being taken forward into COP26 is very important to us. But on its own, that's nothing. And we need to think about how long it took to get from the Stern Review, which was the equivalent for climate change, to legally binding targets from the Paris Agreement. We don't have that sort of a timescale for biodiversity. So we really need COP15 next year to be a decisive moment for countries around the world as we really move on change at this level. And to sort of hark back to your last question, I suppose, that means for all of us, that means activity for individuals, for us all to make choices, for businesses to behave differently, and for governments to set the policy framework, because businesses will be disadvantaged unless the policy framework favours making the right choices. And businesses don't exist to be disadvantaged, to do good and be disadvantaged by it. So we need all three of those pieces. So yes, I hate it when people push it back and say it's down to us all individually to take the bus more. But I think we do have responsibilities as individuals, and those responsibilities include putting pressure on governments as to what we want them to do, and putting pressure on businesses with our own consumer power as to what we want them to do.
Thank you. I mean, Max, you through your work deal with a lot of businesses, corporate organisations. Do you see signs of change, and do you feel the kind of evidence that comes through in things like the Dasgupta Review are persuasive in that regard?
Interestingly, I don't see the latter. No, I don't think so. Most of the work that I do is in relation to what you have to do. What's laid down in pretty much black and white. But where I do notice a significant difference is the respect that I have as an ecologist contributing to the various projects that I undertake. That's not just me. That's felt across many in the team. That there is a recognition that we have a serious role, critical role to play. A certain amount of frustration in terms of how to incorporate that into development projects, so a whole range of other aspects of the work that we do, but definitely a significant shift. And I think that is really important in terms of a number of things that we've been talking about just now, that it gives us confidence that we have got some sort of basis to build on. But we need to, I think you asked the question a bit earlier, Sally, how are we going to deliver that joined up, bigger, better type of approach? Do we have the skill sets? I think part of the answer to that is that it's nothing particularly surprising about it, but it needs to be a sort of multi-specialist within the ecology environmental management sphere. And you're looking at being able to use GIS to its fullest effect. You need a remote sensor who can interpret and enable you to cover surveys of large areas, etc., and bring all that together in terms of you're contributing to a project, be it in Saudi Arabia or Stevenage. And that, I think we need to increasingly recognise that we need to be working with others. And I think Steve alluded to it as well. They need to be members and part of CIEEM as well. They are ecologists or part of the ecology approach. So I would see us as needing to recognise more than we do, and avoid the risk of also having a sort of other bodies, institutes forming to recognise, ecosystem management, whatever. So yeah, I think that will be really important.
Thank you. I want to bring our lens a little bit closer again and be thinking about the profession. On on Monday this week, we published a report on some work we've been doing this year around diversity and inclusion within the profession, and particularly the lack of people of colour within ecology and environmental management. And we're all sorts of evidence to show that we're not a diverse profession. And as a consequence of that, and maybe because some of the things we do as well, we're not a diverse professional body. How do you think what could we do to change that? What are your ideas as to how we could become a more diverse and inclusive profession? And why is that important?
Sorry, go ahead, Steph.
Okay. I was going to say, it's a huge problem. It was there as an issue through my presidency. During John Box's presidency, we started a working group to look at these issues, and we carried that on. And it was very difficult for us to make an impact because the problem is so pervasive. It's not that at a graduate stage we're not recruiting enough people into our profession. It's the fact that we're not even getting people into these subjects and getting them to follow that. If you know, a lot of the diversity is lost before options are chosen at school, and certainly before university careers are completed. So for me, I think it's about outreach at the really earliest stage and getting that public understanding of the profession, and making sure that the widest possible reach into the community helps us to recruit people from. It's not just about ethnicity, it's about socioeconomic class as well, and it's about just making sure that everyone understands the importance of their engagement with nature. And when people do understand that importance of nature, they'll fight for it, which is really what we need. And then hopefully they'll want to enter a profession that's all about fighting for it. So for me, I guess in a nutshell, it's around the education piece and the outreach from the earliest possible stages.
Thank you. Further thoughts?
I was just going to sort of add to what you're saying, Steph, in that I think we need to accept it's going to take quite a long time to achieve this, and that's really important that we plan for over a number of years. We have tried, we've recognised the issues, and I think so far we really haven't achieved very much. So I think we need to recognise, as just by definition, from an early age, as you're coming up through education, etc., it's influencing that process, so that it could well be anything up to a decade almost before we're actually really seeing significant benefits, and that's the sort of timescale that I think we need to be thinking at. And if we don't do that, we're not going to affect the change we need.
Yeah, I mean, some observations from the university sector. Whenever I step into a room of students who are ecologists or in an environmental field, I see essentially a sea of white middle-class faces. If I go into the business school or the engineering school in Cardiff, it's a completely different demographic. So I think the recruitment at very early phases is critically important in all of this. And I think it does go back even beyond, university level through school level. It's a sector-wide issue. I was in a NRW board meeting 2 days last week, and we were essentially having exactly the same discussion around where could NRW recruit from not just different ethnic groups, but with respect to neurodiversity and class and various other things. Part of the conclusion we came to was that there are an array of roles that don't necessarily fall squarely into the ecological discipline, but in supporting disciplines. you know, tech, IT, for example, where we could recruit, we could grow the ranks of people who were from different backgrounds, from, you know, all of us here, essentially white middle class. One of the interesting examples I can offer is the RSPB has national committees now in each of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales, and England was the most recent. And essentially the England Advisory Committee has been established pretty much with the whole purpose of increasing inclusion around RSPB membership. So if you go off and look at the membership of that advisory committee, it's not the usual suspects of people representing sectors such as forestry or shooting. It's actually a diversity of people who are representing the kind of sectors we need to draw from. So again, it's this business of role modeling, of demonstrating the importance of value of involvement in something that matters to all of us.
Thank you. I mean, sorry, Chris, go on.
Well, I was going to echo from a sort of Scottish angle what Steve was saying as well. I mean, lecturing at Dundee, yes, it's a sea of white faces, not middle class though in our case, and predominantly female too in environmental science. And similarly, when I was a director of CEPA in the environmental science, the percentage that were female was higher than male. But of course, then when you get to the top levels, that changes dramatically. The National Park, Loch Lomond and the Trossachs are doing exactly the same as Steve has just sort of been explaining for other organisations, looking desperately at how we include the areas that we recognise we haven't got. How do we get people out into the park? There's a fantastic group, Boots and Beards, which is one of the most influential Asian groups for walking. And that's the sort of example. And we're looking at our national park plan for the first time and thinking, how in heck do we write a national park plan in a completely different way? We're going to have to build and bring people into the writing and the process and the engagement of that we've never done before. And we're actually up for that. We're trying to think how we do that with modern technology, but how do we recognize that around the table we are, as the National Park Group, you know, are not diverse in that sense. So I think the mere fact that we're thinking about it, but it's at what level? Because at the very youngest level, I don't think this exists as a problem. It's like lots of things. It's only as you get up, you know, get older and you start specializing into different areas and you run into all sorts of typologies as to what you might do and therefore what you are able to do and what you're capable of doing and what you have access to, that all of these start bringing together. So I think there is hope here. And you know, I take a lot of confidence from what Steve was saying RSPB are doing. Maybe we ought to try and learn from that.
Absolutely. And I noticed in the chat, Irene Williams saying that she noticed during lockdown that there appeared to be much more access of natural areas and use of engagement with nature through more ethnically diverse communities. So perhaps we need more lockdowns, was her suggestion. But this is part of our championing change agenda within CIEEM. I think it's really, really important. I've been in this field for you know, many years, like you have, and we seem to have been talking about this and sort of beating our breasts about this for so long, and nothing much has really changed. But I think there is hope now, I think, because there's enough momentum behind it, and there's enough organisations through you know, environmental NGOs, professional bodies, other academia, other organisations really determined to make a difference, but certainly to reach out to schools and to reach, you know, bigger groups of society to sell the possibility of careers within our sector and career, you know, green jobs, and try and engage interest and persuade the decision makers, which isn't always the child, in terms of what might be a potential career. So I really hope we can, you know, we can make a difference there. But it's not a numbers game. You know, if you look at gender across our membership, for example, it would appear that from those who have described themselves as male or those that describe themselves as female, that it's at least 50-50 sort of spread. But the quality of the experience is very different. And once you start drilling down into what it's like to be a female ecologist, environmental manager, or a male ecologist, environmental manager, that can paint a very different picture. So it's not about the numbers, it's also about the experience. At this point, I'm going to ask Jason, who's carefully looking after us, whether there are any questions from the audience that you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, so there's two come in, thanks, Sally. One's around climate change, mentioning the fact that the Landscape Institute has brought in a new CPD requirement, mandatory CPD requirement on climate change, and whether the panel has any thoughts on whether CIEEM membership should include something like that.
Thanks, Jason. Just before I put that to the panel, it might be worth noting we have a really excellent Action 2030 working group that have identified a number of challenges and actions for CIEEM. And one of those that we are going to be starting early in the new year is a review of our competency framework. And part of the purpose of that is to make sure it reflects some of the the knowledge and skills and competencies that we've been talking about in terms of helping our profession to be fit to help deliver on actions to address climate emergency and biodiversity crisis. So I think looking at how we reflect this in our competency framework is going to be really, really important. We're also doing a review of our training provision to make sure that we're providing the learning opportunities for our members and others within the profession as well. But what are the panel's thoughts on mandatory CPD in relation to climate change and the biodiversity crisis?
I mean, Sally, I think you've answered the question really well already. But yeah, I do think that it would be reasonable to expect that someone who identified as an ecologist or environmental manager was really up to date and well informed about these issues. So yes, I would certainly support it. And I agree that what's needed is a fairly comprehensive review of our competencies and our approach to training so that we can look at how the profession will be fit for the future. We've talked this evening around the need to be able to sort of look at those interactions, to looking at across a wider field of activity from a biodiversity lens. Despite the fact that we're not a consultants club, a lot of the work that's done by our members, whether they're consultants or NGOs or SNCOs or in industry, a lot of our work is around development, around that 7% of the UK that's developed land. And we need to be better versed in land management. We need to look at the rest of the countryside and move really from being an organisation, from being a profession that knows a lot about survey and assessment to an organisation that knows a lot about management and delivery, and move from really attempting to mitigate and recording loss to actually delivering gain.
Absolutely. I'm involved on behalf of CIEEM at the moment in a project looking at the delivery of environmental land management advice, and one of the and devising a competency framework for those roles. And it's very clear that there's a real need to make sure that we are more knowledgeable. I accept what Chris said previously about the fact that we sometimes you don't know all the answers, and you have to be confident in what you think will happen, but then be prepared to acknowledge it when things turn out differently, and learn from those experiences and look at the evidence. But we need to be much stronger in terms of habitat creation, habitat restoration, ongoing management and monitoring. And unfortunately, a lot of training is driven by employers, driven by legislation, policy, the requirements of the client. But I think that's an area where we really need to improve.
Sally, can I, at the risk of saying heresy, it might still.
Well, I like a bit of heresy.
Yeah, but pointing out that I am the lead author of the chapter on nature-based solutions in fresh waters in relation to climate change for British Ecological Society. So I'll put that on one side and just say, I agree that we should certainly have something in there about climate change. What has increasingly worried me from a number of places is the muddling up of climate change and biodiversity loss. and the assumptions that nature-based solutions are going to solve both, or the actions for one, whichever, is going to help solve the actions for the others. Those of us who are old enough know that, you know, the reason we have no forests in Britain has got nothing to do with climate change. The reason our freshwater is in dire straits, if you go back, its origins has nothing to do with climate change. Looking forward, climate change is a phenomenally complicated and fast-moving, which is having a lot of impact on biodiversity. But there's an awful lot of the current state of biodiversity which owes nothing to climate change. It owes almost everything to land management and the way in which we did it. That may have impacts on climate change, yes, but it just does concern me that I've heard from a lot of people that actually they think that by doing climate change, it's solving biodiversity, or by doing nature-based solutions, it's actually solving climate change. You know, the climate change issues are about transport, about personal behavior, it's about, you know, carbon. It's important to actually recognize these are twin existential threats. They're not the same threat that something cuddly called nature-based solutions is going to solve. And it does worry me that that's actually what I've heard in a lot of places. So that's my bit of heresy.
Thank you. Any thoughts, Max or Steve?
I think it's interesting. I think there are. I share some of Chris's concern around what is turning into a little bit of a widespread assumption that if you solve climate problems, you solve nature, because palpably that is not true. There are aspects of biodiversity erosion that are not climate oriented. But to go back to the original questioner, given that there are substantial climate pressures on ecosystems, I think I'm a little bit surprised that ecologists don't understand climate change. I think it's because it is such a major pressure. Having said that, there are clearly opportunities for management around natural flood management, nature-based solutions, the use of nature in adaptation that take us into areas of development and continuing CPD and learning that I'm sure we should be engaging with. So if I take an example here in Wales, we have certain members of government have an aspiration for dramatically expanding the woodland cover in Wales, you know, something like 80 something million trees, which we should have started planting in 2010 and we're falling desperately behind. Well, the questions over where you plant those trees for carbon sequestration depend on the sensitivity of the trees you plant to changing climatic circumstances. They depend on soil type. They depend on delivering for carbon sequestration and biodiversity. They depend on delivering benefits for other ecosystems, such as rivers downstream, that make this actually quite a complicated area to understand. So I think there is a really big opportunity for development in the way that ecologists think about the way adaptation and mitigation can be used through ecology and ecological management for climate benefit.
Thank you. And Max, did you have a?
I think I'd just like to pick up on what Steve was saying there in terms of thinking about the role that CIEEM would have in terms of sort of the various aspects of climate change, and also linking to what you were saying, Chris, in terms of nature-based solutions. And yes, we need to be providing training, encouraging members to come forward to provide training. We need to be looking at the next conferences that we run to make sure that we're bringing all that best practice, new ideas, and helping our members so that when they do take the test, as it were, in terms of, are they up to date and able with respect to climate change, that we've given them the support that they're going to need. Because again, looking at our team here in AECOM, there's an awful lot of effort goes into that aspect that we were talking about in terms of the sort of assessment, appraisal, monitoring sort of an approach. it is development led, and there are other ecosystems out there in terms of the agricultural environment, forestry, marine environment, and so on that we need to understand as well. So there's a lot of work to do, but we need to keep chipping away at it.
Thank you. I mean, for my own part, I'm slightly wary of developing a whole new raft of CPD that is labelled, this is linked to the climate emergency, this is linked to the biodiversity crisis. If we get our training right, both at undergraduate and apprenticeship level, and if we review what we offer in terms of how the learning might contribute to us addressing the biodiversity crisis and or the twin threat of the climate emergency. That's what I feel we should be doing. I'm a bit nervous about labelling a product up as this will help you deal with this particular issue or this particular threat. I do think we could be doing a lot more to keep members up to date with evidence linked to addressing these issues, but I'm just a bit nervous about labelling CPD in that way, or learning opportunities in that way.
And it should really underpin everything, shouldn't it? It should be just there as an underpinning.
It needs to run through everything that we're doing. Absolutely. Jason, you said there was a second question?
There is. It's unclear what it refers to, though. So it says, is it possible to have a matrix plan, good, better, best? If Susan's still on the call, which it looks like she is, if she could elaborate on that, that would be useful.
Okay, so hopefully whilst Susan is going to elaborate on that, I'm going to ask you to start thinking about the killer question at the end, which is, what do you, or I guess, what are your ambitions or your aspirations, your hopes for the Institute over the next 30 years? What do you want it to achieve? Where do you want it to be in 30 years' time? I don't think we've had anything from Susan yet. So given that time is running away from us, I'm going to just open that up to the floor. What are your aspirations or ambitions for CIEEM over the next 30 years?
We're all going to either not talk or talk at once, aren't we? I will go. What do I hope we can achieve in the next 30 years? I'd like to see us as a more diverse profession. I'd like to see us as a more respected profession. So, and for me, that involves becoming a regulated profession. So you can't just hang a sign up and become an ecologist or environmental manager, that it actually means something, because we all, as a society, understand how important biodiversity is, how important the natural environment is, underpinning everything that all of us do. And therefore, the people that we get in to advise us about that and tinker with that, goodness, shouldn't they be more qualified than the man who comes to fix your gas boiler? So that for me is an important step forward. And then finally, that I hope we find our voice, we continue to find our voice, and are better at advocating for the natural environment. I really think the policy and advocacy work that we've been doing is hugely important, because it's coming not just from interested parties or people who are activists, but from people who have the scientific evidence base and should be advocating for the natural environment. So I hope that we'll be very much seen as a force for good.
That's got us off to a really good start, but lots to do.
Can I pick up on what you were saying there, Steph, and sort of taking that for me to the next stage? And you did allude to this earlier. I mean, today, in terms of all sorts of different aspects of the way in which we deal with the environment, you have engineers, we have planners, and so on, who are providing the lead. 30 years from now, I would like that sort of confidence, those things you've been talking about, and the regulated profession to put us in the position where it's an ecologist or an environmental manager who is providing, if not the leadership, but a significant part of the leadership in delivering our environmental management, and that we have a serious leadership role. And I fear if we don't, then we're going to be in real trouble.
Thank you. It's very much food for thought. Chris, your aspirations for the Institute for the next 30 years?
Well, I guess that, a simplistic one is that at least one, if not more, members of CIEEM get a Nobel Prize because ecology is so important. I mean, I remember Nico Timberg, Konrad Lorenz and Otto von Frisch being awarded jointly the Nobel Prize, and everyone going, blimey, so behavioural ecology is actually important. In certain circles, and lots of other circles, it was absolutely irrelevant, of course. But, so slightly simplistically, I think I'd build on what Steph said. I think respect is absolutely key. It's all about us being the advisors of choice, the natural place to go to get information. And one of the practical things we can do way, way quicker than 30 years is actually get a lot more university courses accredited by CIEEM. I think there's only one in Scotland, and give good credit to Edinburgh Napier and Jennifer Dodd and the work being done there. And I think Dundee are now applying for one. But actually, to get in at that level so that people understand, and I think that will do us and the profession and the education side a lot of good. But otherwise, I would agree with Steph on what she was saying about diversity in that area.
Great. And Steve?
It's interesting. You've all kind of come to what I would suggest are near market probes about accreditation of ecologists and the training of ecologists. And I think if we look back over the last 30 years, one of the things we realise is how much the operating environment for ecology has just changed dramatically. It's changed out of all recognition. And I think we can't even begin to imagine what the next 30 years could be like, how serious the problems of environmental management and biodiversity decline could become, and how serious climate and other environmental pressures could become. And I think we've got to start to imagine that operating environment to understand just exactly what it is that ecologists and environmental managers have to deliver. That to me comes with a whole range of questions about what our environmental legislation looks like going forward. We know we're in a nature and climate emergency, but I'm not aware of anybody or anywhere in the United Kingdom where that is recognised in our current legislation. And if anything, there are probably moves to unpick what we've got rather than bolster what we've got to meet some of those new challenges. And I think we've got to be thinking in that kind of advocacy space. There are dramatic changes in the way that methods in ecology are being used. Environmental DNA, remote sensing to fill the gap in the void that we can no longer fill in environmental monitoring and assessment. How is that ground truth? How does it tell us about environmental change? And that's before we go anywhere near to the big challenges we've got around restoring ecosystems, having appropriate protected areas, having outcomes for nature that are built into development, tackling pollution, financing nature conservation and environmental management. The operating environment of the future will be very different by 2051 from what it is now. And we have got to be sure as a movement and an institute and a whole set of supporting structures that ecologists are prepared to meet those conditions.
Thank you. I mean, it's a real challenge. It's hard to look from a practitioner perspective much beyond 10 years, let alone 30 years. It is a real challenge, but I think it's also a key role of the Institute. I think CIEEM will be transformed in the next 30 years. It will look very differently, but its role in a way will have stayed the same. And a key part of that role is to help provide a voice for the ecology and environmental management profession, and also to help ensure that the practitioners themselves are able and equipped to fulfill the roles that they will need to be fulfilling. That ultimately is the purpose, I think, of a professional body. Thank you. That's been really interesting. I really have enjoyed talking to you all. I feel I've learned a lot, and some really, really interesting perspectives from people that, you know, all of you at a time have led our institute and led our profession. And your wit and your wisdom has certainly served us well in the past and has served us well again tonight. So thank you all very much for your contribution. Thank you to all those that attended and joined us. And thank you to Jason for organising it. And just a reminder that this will be on our YouTube channel and on our the Resource Hub on our website, probably within a day or two. So please tell others that it's worth a listen and where to find it. So thank you all very much for your time, and we'll say good night.
Good night.
Good night. Thanks very much, Sally. Great to see the rest of you.